Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving deep into some historical evidence around the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. We've got all sorts of cool stuff to dig through, articles, research, insights from scientists and theologians.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah, it's a story that's been analyzed and debated for centuries.
For sure. And we're going to be looking at it from all these different angles,
Yeah.
right? Like the historical side, the archaeology, even some forensic science.
Definitely. We're going to try to cover it all.
Awesome. So let's just jump right in. Okay. Let's start with the crucifixion itself. You know, we see it everywhere in art and movies, but what was it actually like? Like, really?
Well, think of it like this. Crucifixion was the most brutal form of capital punishment the Romans had. It wasn't just about killing someone, it was about maximum pain and humiliation.
Right, right. It was meant to be a deterrent, for sure. And some of the sources describe the process in such excruciating detail, like the scourging with a whip with pieces of metal and bone. Ooh. And then, of course, the nailing to the cross. I mean, just the word excruciating literally means out of the cross. Like, the pain was so bad, that's where the word comes from.
Exactly. That's right. It was invented to describe that specific agony.
Wow. So, I mean, how do we know for sure that Jesus actually died on the cross? Aside from the biblical accounts, I mean.
Well, we actually have quite a few non-Christian sources. They confirm the crucifixion. Historians like Josephus.
Oh, right, yeah.
And Tacitus mentioned it. And even the Jewish Talmud acknowledges it.
Huh. Interesting. So even people who weren't exactly fans of Christianity agreed that happened.
That's right.
What about the physical aspects of it all? Was it really as brutal as they say?
Absolutely. Like if you look at the Shroud of Turin, for example.
Right. The burial cloth.
Yeah, some people believe that's what it is. And if it's authentic, the forensic analysis of it really paints a really vivid picture of his suffering. Like there's evidence of the scourging, the crown of thorns, and wounds that line up with crucifixion.
It's hard to imagine, honestly.
Yeah.
One of the sources I read, a forensic pathologist who studied the shroud, said the level of suffering was even worse than what was shown in that movie, The Passion of the Christ.
It's definitely something that we, can't fully comprehend. It's a stark reminder of just how much he went through physically.
For sure. The sources also talk about this thing called hematidrosis, where your sweat actually turns to blood. Is that even possible?
It is, yeah. It's rare. But it happens when someone is under extreme duress, like think extreme anxiety or stress.
Yeah.
The body just goes into overdrive and tiny blood vessels rupture, leaking blood into the sweat glands.
So basically your body's so stressed out it starts bleeding.
Pretty much. And we know from the Gospels that Jesus was under an incredible amount of pressure leading up to the crucifixion.
Absolutely. So it stands to reason that his body could have reacted that way.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics. Like, what kind of cross was Jesus crucified on?
Well, there's been some debate, but most sources point to what's called a tau cross.
A tau cross.
Yeah, it's shaped like the letter T.
Interesting. And did Jesus carry the whole cross, like we see in all the depictions?
Probably not the whole thing.
Oh.
Most likely, he carried just the crossbeam, what they call the patibulum, which would have been attached to the vertical beam or stybe already at the site.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, he was already so weak from everything else.
Right. A full cross could weigh well over 200 pounds. That would be nearly impossible to carry, especially in his condition.
Okay, this might be a tough one to talk about, but how exactly was Jesus nailed to the cross? I mean, where did they put the nails?
Well, based on what we know from forensics and history, it seems most likely they were driven through what's called the thenar furrow. It's a space at the base of the palm and then out through the wrists.
So not directly through the palms, like we always see.
Right.
Huh. And what about his feet?
They were probably nailed directly to the stipe with his knees bent.
That's hard to even think about. But I think it's important to understand the extent of the trauma he went through.
It definitely gives us a different perspective. And the sources go into the intense pain that would come from these injuries, like the nails going through his hands. That would sever the median nerve. Searing pain, shooting up his arms.
Awful. And to think he endured all of that willingly.
Yeah. I mean, that's a core belief in Christianity, that it was an act of love and sacrifice.
One source even went into the medical realities of what happened. Collapsed lungs, hypovolemic shock. Pretty intense stuff.
Not for the faint of heart, that's for sure.
Definitely not. Speaking of hypovolemic shock, the sources say that's probably what actually killed him, right? Not asphyxiation or a heart attack like a lot of people think.
Right.
So can you explain a bit more about that?
Sure. Hypovolemic shock happens when the body loses a significant amount of blood and fluids. And between the scourging, the crown of thorns, and the crucifixion itself, Jesus would have lost a lot of blood
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
and become severely dehydrated,
Yeah.
which all leads to this condition.
There was this one detail in the sources that really stuck with me. It mentioned that when Jesus was pierced with a spear after his death, blood and water flowed out. Is there a reason that's mentioned?
Well, it's significant for a couple reasons, actually. First, it backs up the idea that he was already dead. That separation of blood and fluids like that is a sign of cardiac arrest.
Oh, okay. So it's like further evidence that he had already died.
Right.
Interesting.
And then symbolically, the blood and water represent the sacraments of the Eucharist and baptism, central to Christian faith.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
So some see it as kind of a foreshadowing the birth of the church.
Wow. That adds a whole other layer of meaning to it.
It really does. It does. Now, let's move on.
Right.
Let's talk about the resurrection. The sources, they talk about all kinds of evidence around this, from the empty tomb to, how it changed the lives of the disciples.
Yeah, okay. The whole empty tomb thing. Where do we even begin with that?
Well, imagine trying to convince people in Jerusalem that Jesus had risen from the dead if his body was still in a tomb, right? I mean, it just wouldn't have worked.
True. I mean, wouldn't somebody have just pointed to the body and been like, nope, case closed?
Exactly, you would think. And what's interesting is that the earliest arguments against the resurrection, they kind of support the empty tomb narrative. They were saying, oh, the disciples stole the body, which means even they admitted it wasn't there.
Uh-huh. So they couldn't say the tomb wasn't empty, so they tried to come up with another explanation?
Exactly. And then there's the whole thing about the women being the first ones to see the empty tomb.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
remember reading about that.
Yeah.
But I didn't quite get why that was so important.
Okay, so back then, women weren't considered reliable witnesses. Their word wouldn't have held up in court. So you wouldn't make them your star witnesses if you were fabricating a story.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense.
So the fact that the Gospels highlight this detail, even though it might seem like a problem, suggests they were committed to telling it like it was, even if it wasn't, the most convenient version.
Yeah, it's like they were saying, look, this is what happened, whether you believe it or not.
Exactly. One of the sources actually points out 3 things that support the empty tomb idea. 1, it happened in Jerusalem, right in the heart of everything. 2, there were people who would have loved to disprove it. And 3, the primary witnesses were women.
Huh, yeah? Taken together, that's a pretty strong argument.
Right. It's not definitive proof, but it's compelling.
It definitely adds a whole new layer to the resurrection narrative.
For sure. The sources also mention a couple of things that could be physical evidence. The Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those, but I'm not really sure what they are.
Okay, so the Shroud of Turin, it's this linen cloth with an image of a man who appears to have suffered wounds consistent with crucifixion. Some people think it was the burial cloth of Jesus.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And the Sudarium.
That one is thought to be the face cloth that was on Jesus, mentioned in the Gospel of John. It has blood stains and other fluids that match the blood type from the Shroud of Turin.
Wow. So have scientists been able to, prove they're authentic?
Well, it's not that simple. They tried to date the shroud using carbon dating, but the results were all over the place. Some people think the samples were contaminated. Others say the shroud is a fake from the Middle Ages.
So it's still a mystery.
Pretty much. But even if we never get a definitive answer about their authenticity, the fact that they exist and that scientists keep studying them, it just adds to the fascination,
Definitely. They make you think about, what if? What if they really are what people say they are?
Right. It opens up all these possibilities. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the disciples. How did their beliefs play into all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it must have been hard to wrap their heads around the whole resurrection idea.
It was a huge shift for them. Their entire worldview was turned upside down. I mean, they saw Jesus die, and then suddenly they're saying he's alive again.
Yeah. So what made them believe that?
The sources talk about a number of appearances Jesus made to his disciples after the resurrection. Some were one-on-one, some were to groups.
Were they, just seeing him from afar? Or was there more to it?
No, it sounds like it was a lot more than just seeing him. They interacted with him, they touched him, they ate with him.
Wow. That must have been incredibly powerful.
It was. It completely changed their understanding of Jesus.
And they believed it so strongly that they were willing to face persecution, even death, to share their beliefs.
Exactly. They were convinced they had seen something truly miraculous, something beyond logic, and they risked everything to tell the world about it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, you wonder what they actually experienced that made their faith so strong.
That's the million-dollar question, right? What was the nature of these post-resurrection appearances? Were they just, subjective experiences? Or was something else going on? We don't get all the answers, but the sources offer some interesting thoughts. Like, one source was written by a physicist, but he's also a Christian, and he says that science can't prove or disprove the resurrection, but it also doesn't rule out the possibility of supernatural events.
That's interesting. So, like, faith and science aren't necessarily enemies.
Right. He's basically saying that faith can be informed by evidence, but it also requires a leap of faith. You got to be willing to believe in things you can't see or touch.
It's about trusting in something bigger than yourself, even when you don't have all the answers.
That's it. And that's an idea that resonates with all kinds of people, not just Christians.
Definitely. The sources also make it clear that the disciples' belief in the resurrection wasn't just some, like, abstract idea.
Right. It was a lived experience that changed them.
They went from being sad and confused to becoming these bold preachers spreading the word about Jesus.
And their message led to the early church and ultimately the spread of Christianity around the world.
It's incredible. I mean, in a way, all of Christianity, with all its followers and history, it's all because of their belief.
Yeah. It's hard to deny the impact. Whether you believe in it or not, the story of the resurrection changed the world.
And it's still shaping our world today, even if we don't always realize it.
Absolutely. And that's why it's worth exploring, diving deep into the evidence and thinking about what it all means.
It challenges us to look at our own beliefs and be open to the possibility that there's more to reality than we know.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, right? We explore together, we look at the evidence, we consider different views.
And hopefully we give you some stuff to think about.
Exactly. And maybe inspire you to keep exploring on your own.
So what stood out to you from this deep dive? What will you take with you?
The journey isn't over. Keep digging, keep asking questions.
Find your own truth.
And until next time, keep exploring. It really does. One of the sources pointed out how some core Christian practices, they're rooted in those events.
Oh, really?
What?
Which ones?
Well, Sunday gatherings. That tradition comes from the fact that the resurrection happened on a Sunday.
Oh, right, yeah. Makes sense. It became a celebration of new life.
Exactly. And then there's baptism, symbolizing death and resurrection through being immersed in water.
Yeah. It's like a mirroring of Jesus's journey. Death and then new life.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's communion. Sharing bread and wine, remembering Jesus' sacrifice.
Right, the body and blood given for forgiveness of sins.
Exactly. And these practices, they've been central to Christianity for centuries. And they all go back to the crucifixion and resurrection.
It's amazing to think about how those events from so long ago still shape the lives of so many people today.
It really is. It shows how powerful and significant the story is.
One of the sources said something that really got me thinking. It was talking about how Jesus's death wasn't just about, physical suffering.
Oh, you mean the idea that he also went through this immense emotional and spiritual pain?
Yeah, exactly. Source even quoted some of St. Faustina's visions, where she described Jesus feeling this deep sorrow, like because of the betrayal and abandonment from those closest to him.
Right, yeah. It's a reminder that he was human. He felt everything we feel.
It makes you think about his sacrifice in a whole new way,
Yeah.
He wasn't just going through physical agony. He was also experiencing intense emotional suffering. And he still did it, willingly.
It's a tough concept to grasp. The depth of his love, his willingness to bear that much pain for us.
It really makes you think about how our own actions, even like little things, can contribute to that suffering.
That's a powerful thought. It challenges us to live differently, be more aware of how our choices affect ourselves and others.
Yeah, for sure. There's this one source written by a physicist that offered a really cool perspective on the resurrection. He said something about how science can't definitively prove or disprove it, but it doesn't rule out the possibility of, like, supernatural events.
Right, I remember that. He's saying there's room for both, right? Faith and science.
Yes. It's so refreshing to hear that, especially these days, when faith and reason are often seen as being at odds.
Definitely. It's a reminder that we should be open to new ideas, acknowledge what we don't know, and consider that there might be more to reality than we realize.
Absolutely. So I guess this brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've looked at the historical evidence for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, from the physical brutality of his death to the mystery of the empty tomb and the profound impact it had on his followers.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey. The evidence, while not definitive proof, is definitely compelling. It raises questions that we're still asking centuries later.
And no matter what you believe personally, you have to admit, the story of Jesus is incredibly powerful. It's a story of love, sacrifice, and hope, and it continues to impact our world today.
It is, and it's a story that challenges us to think about some of the biggest questions, life, death, what happens after we die.
That's the beauty of the deep dive, right? We get to explore these fascinating topics, uncover the evidence, and hear different perspectives. Hopefully, we've given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to keep digging deeper on your own.
Exactly. So, what resonated with you the most from today's deep dive? What will you take away with you?
The journey doesn't end here, folks. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and seek your own truth.
Until next time, keep diving.